So, Separate Ways came out. It was announced a week before release, which is honestly unheard of from big developers, or developers at all. Like, when was the last time that you can think of where a developer announced something so anticipated or substantial, and then just released it a week later? I mean, to be fair, everyone already knew that this DLC was coming out. There were files in the game referencing it since the game's release, and for a while you could use mods to play as Ada and Wesker in the Mercenaries game mode. So it was only a matter of time before Capcom officially announced the content. I personally was expecting it to release sometime next year, to be honest, but we have it now, so let's talk about it. It's going to be a spoiler-free review, or as spoiler-free as I can make it. If you don't like that, sorry, but that means you've already played it, so I'm kind of confused as to why you'd be here, but hey, you do you. Now, I just want to say before I start that I'm not actually a big fan of DLC. I feel personally that most of the time its inclusion is okay, but it always feels like it doesn't need to exist. Best way I can describe it is Dark Souls 2. I have all the DLCs, but I never play them, yet I've beaten the main campaign countless times. Why? Because I don't feel like they are part of the game. They are mini areas, mini stories that are disconnected and don't matter to the rest of the world. A lot of the time, developers use DLC as a way to try new things as well, which is all good and well, but sometimes they go as far as to change the way the game works completely and ruin the flow. For example, the Evil Within's Kidman DLC is literally just a run and hide simulator. I was devastated when I was playing it and found this out. Why would you even do that? The combat in that game is fun, if brutal, and is part of the game's identity. What sucks even more is that it has explanations to the story that are integral to understanding the plot in its entirety. So, in other words, my experience with DLC is rough. Not to say that all DLC is like this. Dark Souls 1 and 3 have amazing DLC, and Borderlands games usually have some fun extra areas, but overall, they feel weird to me, and I don't understand how to explain that appropriately with my caveman vocabulary skills. But Separate Ways feels like it belongs. It fits right at home, and honestly, I couldn't compliment this content enough for just how amazing it really is. However, I've seen people complain that it is a paid DLC. Why though? For us Aussies over here down under, the DLC is $14.24, which for what you get is nothing. I was so shocked with how long this campaign was. I streamed the whole thing on hardcore difficulty on my Twitch, and I was expecting about a 3-hour completion. Instead, it took me 5 hours. For other people, it took 7. So this DLC is pretty substantial in comparison to other DLC priced the same. Heck, Shadows of Rose for Village was $28.49, and that was 3 hours long, with most of the areas being reused from the base game. I mean, look at Resident Evil 3 Remake. That was about 5 hours long, and that was a fully priced product. This DLC really puts into perspective just how badly they stuffed up with RE3 and how unprepared they were to make any type of expansion to Village. Separate Ways makes them both look lazy in comparison. Alright, so what do you get with this DLC? You get Ada's campaign, which is shorter than Leon's, but it adds much needed context to things that were missing from Leon's adventure. What happened to the other Verdugo? Where are areas such as the Laser Hall and Castle Sewers? What about missing bosses? Well, they're all here. They were kept for re-inclusion for Ada, and in turn, most of Ada's content is entirely new. You do visit some familiar locations, such as the village and castle main entrance and hall, but everything that you do in these areas are also new. You have access to the merchant, who functions identically to Leon's campaign, and you also get new weapons, these being the shorty shotgun and the explosive crossbow, the latter of which I barely used because of how freaking big it was. No new enemies, unfortunately, but all the bosses except one are unique to Ada, and even the reused one introduces new elements to the fight. Honestly, I am simply amazed at how this genuinely feels like a B scenario to Leon. Nothing here is half-assed. You can feel the love of the craft oozing out of every encounter, out of every area. That all might sound like a no-brainer, but to put this in perspective, the original RE4 also had Separate Ways, which was added to the PS2 port to entice people who already bought the GameCube version to buy the inferior port. This version, whilst a nice inclusion, honestly feels rushed. Ada visits the same locations with very rare new ones, fights the same enemies, fights very similar bosses, and can't even upgrade her weapons as the merchant for some reason has that option grayed out. It's overall just very short. A first playthrough shouldn't take more than 3 hours. The new things, such as the submarine area, aren't really that fun, and her last boss, Unmutated Sadler, feels like he belongs from a different game. His animations are very jerky, and his moves are lackluster, which honestly just describes this extra campaign. The only real use for it is to unlock Leon and Ashley's secondary set of alternative costumes, items, which admittedly are cool, and Ashley's one dons her in a suit of armor and makes her both invincible and unable to be carried. But apart from that, it's only worth playing once. Now back to the remake. I don't really want to talk too much about the story, as it has some nice inclusions and surprises. Something that only just dawned on me in this campaign though, is that Krauser in this remake isn't a double agent for Wesker, which is something I completely missed despite the fact that I have 100%ed the base game. There's a point in the campaign that mentions this, and I was just like, oh yeah, you know what, that makes sense. That's just me being a me though. But yeah, just know that Ada is doing stuff for Wesker. That's as much as I'm willing to say here. The combat is overall the same. However, Ada can use her grapple gun to her advantage by using it to close the distance on stunned enemies for melee hits, grappling enemy shields away, or using the grapple in boss fights for special attacks. Apart from that, it's still the same shoot melee parry system that you either love or hate with a passion. The soundtrack is all new too, with remixed pieces from both RE2 and RE4. They have a more spy espionage take to them, except for the save theme, which is excellent, but definitely different from the rest. I'm not good at describing music myself, so just trust me when I say it suits her. Now, I remember when I did my other RE4 video, I mentioned that I didn't like Ada's voice, but now I've grown to appreciate it. This DLC really helps in broadening out her role, and she shows way more nuance and emotion in this campaign than she ever did with the main story. She's not as monotone in her delivery, and the interactions that she has with Luis and Wesker really help to expand her character and show that she isn't just some agent for hire, that she's a human being with a past that haunts her, which in turn influences who she is and how she interacts with the people around her. I really don't have anything negative to say about this campaign either. I remember beating Shadows of Rose, and upon completion, I had no interest in playing that DLC again. Apart from the third-person perspective and the introduction of her powers, I felt that it didn't really add anything interesting and was boring to look at. But this isn't the case with this Separate Ways campaign. I mean, one real complaint would have to be the final gauntlet, which is timed, and when there's a timer on screen, I panic and end up rushing and making stupid decisions that make my game harder. So, in all honesty, that's more of a me problem rather than the game problem. I guess another issue I have is the lack of any new base enemies. This isn't really a problem per se, as the combat with the already established monsters is fun and rewarding in and of itself, but I guess a new enemy type or two might have helped to spice up combat a little bit. Also, there is one particular area that, whilst awesome, kind of falls flat a little bit, as it introduces a boss that you don't really get to fight, but rather run away from, and you don't really have any direct input into its defeat. Still, this is also minor, and the area that it is set in is entirely new content and really opens up the lore as well, to the point where it made me actually read all the files in the area instead of just skimming over them like I usually do. I really want to play this DLC again and unlock the rest of the bonuses and achievements. I'm not a completionist by any stretch, but RE4 really made me want to master it and see everything that it has to offer, and this DLC is no different. Honestly, RE4 Remake didn't need this content to exist. Controversial, I know, but it was a solid product that already had tons of replayability and unlockables. But I'm glad Separate Ways came out. Think of it like a pizza. RE4 is the pizza with all the toppings you'd want, and Separate Ways is a cheesy crust that just makes it all that more delicious. I'm not gonna say anymore. Get this DLC immediately and play it.